Hello class, this is Professor Isaac, and in this lecture we're going to be going over conventional and sustainable forms of energy. So rather than thinking about energy that is harmful to the environment, energy that is not sustainable over a long period of time, in this lecture we're going to be going over good sources of energy, alternative sources of energy, energy sources that are sustainable for the long term. So we're going to think about in this lecture some of the things that we've learned about in previous lectures. We've been focusing a lot on issues like pollution or how the burning of fossil fuels impacts the production of greenhouse gases. So we've often been thinking about the connection between energy and the environment. So based on our previous lectures, you've hopefully understood that energy sources being used end up impacting an ecosystem. So when energy gets used up, for example, if we burn fossil fuels, that produces an impact directly on the environment. Now, sometimes that can happen at different parts of the life cycle, but we know that using energy sources directly causes environmental impacts. Oftentimes those are negative, right? Things like destroying mines, when we extract out precious minerals, for example, we're often destroying the habitat around that area. So for example, in many portions of sub-Saharan Africa where a lot of precious stones were mined, the surrounding areas aren't maintained in terms of keeping that ecosystem intact. What else could happen? Well, when we burn fossil fuels, oftentimes it releases chemical pollution into the atmosphere, right? And that can happen during the refining process. We also burn a lot of our fossil fuels, and so that can release a lot of air pollution, chemical pollution, destruction of a habitat. If you think of something like coal mining. So remember, your three types of fossil fuels are coal, oil, and natural gas. And when we use these energy sources, which we've all used power in our daily life that is from burning fossil fuels, that directly impacts the environment. When we look at certain forms of energy like coal or oil or natural gas, we would group those into a category called non-renewable. What that means is when you use up that energy, there isn't going to be more of it. So for example, if you mine a diamond, when you come back to that same spot next week, there aren't going to be more diamonds there, right? So how about if we use the same analogy for coal? When we remove coal from the earth, we're not then able to generate more of it. It doesn't renew itself. So we refer to it as non-renewable energy. So when we use non-renewable energies, like the ones on the right-hand side of this slide, it's not sustainable for a long period of time because eventually you would run out because these forms of energy aren't renewing themselves. But let's take a look at the forms of energy on the left-hand side of the screen. We would refer to these as renewable forms of energy. So for example, if you stand outside in the sun and it warms your skin and you go out tomorrow, the sun hasn't run out of energy because you used some of it yesterday, because it's a renewable form of energy. We don't run out of it. What's another example of that? Well, wind energy would be an example. If we power something using wind energy, we don't run out of it, meaning that the next day when you go outside, there would still be more wind available. So it's a renewable form of energy. So in our previous lectures, we've talked about non-renewable forms of energy. In this lecture, we're going to talk about renewable forms of energy, and these are considered to be more sustainable because they don't run out. So what we're going to do next is review forms of non-renewable energy and then some forms of renewable energy in much more detail. So let's start with the non-renewable. Non-renewable, remember, those are our fossil fuels, things like coal, oil, and natural gas. And these are used all over the world, right, in global economies that impact our ecosystems in a very significant way. Why? Well, we're using coal, oil, and natural gas. We're extracting them and refining them faster than we could ever generate them. So why? Why is that? Well, it takes millions of years and heat and compression and really high pressure to form these fossil fuels. So we're not able to make more of those fossil fuels to replace them at the rate at which we're using them up. And unfortunately, when we're burning these fossil fuels, it produces a lot of pollution, right? And so it has a lot of negative impacts on our ecosystem. So let's go over each of the fossil fuels: coal, oil, and natural gas. So let's start with oil. Another word for that is petroleum. It's a liquid, and it actually goes through a really long refining process. And if we were to think of all the energy in the world, almost half of it comes from oil. So you all know that oil is a really important source of energy, and we're not really sure if we've reached the peak of oil production, meaning we're not really sure if right now we're at the peak. Is it going to decline more in the future? Could it increase even more? Scientists have tried to estimate that, but we really don't know. So the idea is, we know that we're using a lot, and we know that global consumption rates are very, very high, but we're not necessarily sure, depending on how many alternative sources of fuel are developed, we're not sure what rates of consumption could be like in the future. The other fossil fuel is coal, and the difference between coal and oil has a lot to do with price. First of all, it's very, very cheap compared to oil. What else is different? Well, oil was a liquid, coal is a solid, right? So you could picture like a little rock or a small stone that would look like coal, black. And it's burned, and when it's burned, it produces energy. It's a form of that can be used as a form of electricity. And so throughout the United States, there are places that use coal as a power source. So when we pay our electric bill, we may not know, where did the energy come from when you plug in something into the wall? Well, in many different parts of the country, some of that energy comes from burning coal. And to get the coal requires stripping an ecosystem of many different resources, because coal is mined from underneath the surface of the ground. And so you have to oftentimes even remove a whole mountain to get the coal underneath. So although the coal itself is cheap and plentiful and not expensive, the problem is the amount of land and the amount of ecosystems that are actually destroyed to remove the coal. That's what really is the high price. It's not the actual dollar amount of the coal, it's the price of ruining all that land to mine the coal. And oftentimes when an area is mined very heavily, no one goes back and fixes the area and restores the ecosystem and makes it look like it did beforehand. It's just left in ruins. Another type of fossil fuel is natural gas. And natural gas is really interesting because even in the last 10 years, even in your lifetime, we've been finding more sources of natural gas. So there's a very complicated process to extract the natural gas from underneath the ground and bring it out using a lot of high pressure. And that process is called fracking. And just like our other fossil fuels, the good thing about the fossil fuel is that it gives us energy, right? So the good thing about natural gas is the production of energy. But the negative impact often falls entirely on the environment. So that's where we're often paying the cost for a lot of these fossil fuels. Another non-renewable energy source is not a fossil fuel, but it's another category of non-renewable energy, which is nuclear power. And this is a form of energy that actually uses highly radioactive compounds and does reactions of fission and fusion to produce a huge release of energy. Now, the good thing about this is that it doesn't increase greenhouse gases and it doesn't increase carbon dioxide like the burning of fossil fuels. However, the other risk is that when we have an accident at one of these nuclear power plants, it can release really strong radioactive waste, and that can release radiation into the atmosphere, into the ground, into the surrounding plants. So some of you may have heard about one of the famous accidents that occurred at a nuclear power plant, which was in Chernobyl in Ukraine. And there have been accidents in other countries as well. In the United States, there was an accident at the power plant at 3 Mile Island. And these power plant accidents have made people really worried and hesitant about the potential for releasing radiation. And so it isn't necessarily true that every nuclear power plant would have an accident, but the fear of that has really led to the decrease of nuclear power plants being built all across this country. It's largely because of fear, and a lot of people had the attitude of, well, I don't want a nuclear power plant in my backyard and I don't want it in my area. So that sort of led to the decline of certain types of nuclear power. So we've gone over fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas. We talked a little bit about nuclear power. What other forms of energy are there? Well, now we're going to switch gears a little bit and start to talk about renewable energy sources. So these are going to be different because when you use this energy, you don't run out of it, right? So how come? Well, the source itself is something that's renewable. So the first renewable energy source that we're going to talk about is hydropower. And hydropower, just like the word hydro, relates to water. And so water is actually spinning using a turbine. So the same water can get recycled again and again and again, and it generates a current which can generate electricity. Now, again, this can have some harmful effects on the environment, but nowhere near the effects of the burning of fossil fuels. So, for example, we wouldn't have increased greenhouse gases. We wouldn't have destruction of an ecosystem. But sometimes there are still some harmful effects. For example, when hydropower plants are built, oftentimes the fish in that ecosystem can suffer. It oftentimes can change the temperature in the surrounding area of the water. It can also change the dynamics or the flow of rivers and how waters naturally move. We're now changing those with the turbine. Another source of renewable energy is from municipal solid waste. And you might think, how could waste generate energy? Well, it's by actually burning it. So what you're seeing in this picture is some municipal solid waste, which an easier way to say that is just garbage or trash in a landfill. And when you burn it, you can actually collect electricity from that burn, from that heat. The dead material actually starts to decay in the trash or in the garbage. And as that decays, it actually produces methane gas. And so burning the methane that's produced is a way to generate electricity. And so that's a way where it's renewable because we're constantly producing a lot of waste and we're able to create energy from something that otherwise would be thrown away. So imagine in the waste that we were just talking about, imagine that there were organisms that had cells and tissues. So think of something like some plants that are put into solid waste. Think of some, let's say, chicken bones after someone has some chicken. Those are made up of cells and tissues. Think of a tree trunk. All of that plant fibers, all of that material, when it's burned, actually can generate fuel. So we call that biofuel, and it's made by burning biomass. So on this slide, you can see that even agricultural crops like that corn husk, for example, you can burn the corn husk, and that's a source of fuel. So this is a form of renewable energy because you can constantly generate more biomass, right? You're going to have lots of waste. If you've heard of people doing composting, that can be used as a type of biomass. When deforestation happens and there's extra materials that are thrown out, that could be used as biomass. Animal residues, industrial waste, a lot of that can be used as biomass to generate biofuel. So rather than relying 100% on fossil fuels, if we rely on more renewable energy sources, we're using some of our waste in a constructive way that can produce energy. Another form of renewable energy is geothermal energy, and this uses the heat that's actually trapped right underneath the surface of the earth, and that's a great source of energy. So what you're seeing in the picture on the left of the slide is the heat exchange system and how it runs below the surface of the earth and brings up some of that heat to generate energy. So that never runs out. It's constantly going to be warm, and we can constantly generate more geothermal energy. Sunlight. Sunlight is a big one because we're not running out of it, right? We constantly have more. So that's a form of renewable energy called solar energy. And so you may have seen these types of panels, I'm sure most of you have, oftentimes on the roof of a building. And each one of these little squares contains photovoltaic cells. They're often abbreviated PVC. And those photovoltaic cells can basically store sunlight and then use it as electrical energy. So you could think of them kind of like little storage containers. So they're storing up all that sunlight, and later you can use that as power, right? It can even be used in a battery. It can be used to power the electricity of a huge industrial building. So this is a form of renewable energy because you're not going to run out of it. It pays for itself, right? And these are forms of energy that are less harmful for the environment. Another form of energy that you've probably seen and are familiar with is wind energy. And why is this renewable? Well, we're not going to run out of the wind, right? And so what does the wind do? Well, it spins that turbine around and around and around. And that movement generates electrical current. And that can be used as a form of energy. Now, although this doesn't contribute to things like greenhouse gases, it does have a few negative impacts when organisms can fly into these turbines. So, for example, it can kill birds. So there are some negative impacts, but they're very, very small. Sometimes there's an issue with people not wanting these in their area, right? But usually if we can find large areas of unoccupied land, that's usually where wind energy is harnessed, and oftentimes it's stored within the turbine in a battery, and then later it can be used. So we've gone over some types of renewable energy. What could you say about them? Well, we actually can group them into a category where we can say that all of the energy produced from renewable energy really comes down to just 3 different sources. One, it all basically comes from the sun, or it comes from that heat that's trapped underneath the surface of the earth, or it comes from the force of gravity itself, meaning gravity is pulling things in a particular direction, and that causes us to be able to kind of harness that energy. If you think of something like hydropower, where water is moving, it's moving because of gravity, and so we're able to use that energy. We're able to generate energy. So when we think of renewable energy, why do we have it and how are we able to have it? It's really because sunlight provides energy, because there's heat underneath the surface of the earth, and it's because we have gravity. So when we think of those three sources on the previous slide, out of the three of them, sunlight really is the largest contributor. It's really going to be the biggest source of energy we have available. Why is that? Well, it really plays a huge role in determining what our weather is like. The sun generates the heat that's required for the vaporization that takes place above the ocean, and that really generates a lot of the undercurrent of hydropower. All of the plants that grow, all of the fruits and vegetables, that's only possible because of photosynthesis, and that's a reaction powered by the sun. And so if you think of all the animals that grow, they eat fruits and vegetables, and so that energy source is really the sun, right? So without the sun, without the energy of the sun, life as we know it would cease to exist, right? So when we really think of the largest renewable energy resource, it would be sunlight. So when we think of all of the energy that we need for the whole planet, think of all the cars in the world, all the buildings in the world that have lights on, all the cell phones that need to be charged every day. When we think of the amount of energy that's used, and now we compare it to renewable energy, really there's only a very small amount of the world's energy needs that are being met by renewable energy sources. So the majority of energy that we use globally is non-renewable. Renewable is very, very small. When we think of where renewable energy is used, it's not always only used in wealthy countries or only used in developing countries. Instead, it's often used where it's available. So for example, where is sunlight going to be the most present? Well, it's often in areas right around the equator or right around deserts. When we think of wind energy, where can it be used? Well, it's going to be a lot stronger offshore than right on the land. So it really varies where you can use renewable energy, because you have to use them based on where they are geographically, meaning where you have access to a lot of sunlight, where you have access to a lot of wind, right? That can determine how it's used. It can determine the capacity of that renewable energy to meet people's energy needs. What about hydroelectric energy? Where would we find that most easily utilized? Well, it's going to be in areas where there's a lot of mountains, areas where there's a lot of rain, areas where there's a lot of snow that's available to provide a water source, right? When we think of biomass, we oftentimes are going to be thinking about areas where there's a lot of land, meaning that's an area where they're storing a lot of possibly waste. And so when we think of how renewable energy sources can be used more in the future, we really want to discuss and think about, well, where are they distributed, right? And where are they currently? So when we think about looking ahead and looking to, let's say, the next generation and how can we use more renewable energy sources, there's a lot of things to think about. We can think about, number one, the money, right? What does it cost to switch to renewable resources? Number two, we want to think about where are they, right? If you're talking about a really cold, really cloudy area, it would be harder to use as much solar energy, right? A lot of solar panels would be difficult. But as we look to the future, on this slide, you can see examples of a lot of the ways in which hopefully we can use a lot more renewable energy in the future, right? If we use a lot of biomass, if we think of transforming a lot of our landfills as a source of possible biomass, if we think of our transportation, cars, large 18-wheel vehicles that could possibly in the future rely more heavily on renewable energy. Think of a building and the electricity in that building if it was using a lot of solar energy and wind energy. So the potential in the future to rely more heavily on renewable energy sources is really great. Hopefully in your lifetime you'll get to see that shift where we move away from a lot of fossil fuels and move more towards renewable energy resources. And so I hope going over kind of the basics of each of these different types of energy will give you kind of a good foundation of knowledge so that you now have kind of a platform to learn more as you research more, learn more as you read, so that you can be really well educated about what energy sources are like, what's the difference between renewable and non-renewable, and then hopefully as you hear more about these in the future, you'll have a really good solid base of knowledge so that you can understand the changes that arise in the years to come. So I hope you've enjoyed learning a little bit about renewable and non-renewable resources, and if you have questions about it or if you have concerns, please feel free to contact me, and I look forward to hearing from you.